1863. The Civil War rages across a fractured America. But far from the battlefields, in the quiet hills of Jefferson County, one dying man's final wish sets off a chain of horror no bullet could ever match. His son, his freed servant, and a promise that defied everything the world believed possible. This wasn't just a love that society forbade. It was a promise that would bleed across generations, carving its vengeance into the soil itself. By the time it ended, 3 men would burn alive in the dark. A house would fall silent forever, and one young heir would hang from the same beam where his beloved took her own life. You're about to enter a world where every choice bleeds consequence, where love becomes sin, faith becomes madness, and justice wears the face of vengeance. What began as a father's dying wish ended in blood. If you're watching this, take a deep breath, because the story you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's history that was buried, silenced, and nearly erased. If you believe truth is sometimes more terrifying than any ghost story, hit subscribe to join us here on Legacy of Fear. Now tell me, if you were in his place, how far would you go to keep a promise? The rain fell in thin silver lines across the roof of Livingston Manor, the air heavy with damp wood and sickness. Inside, only 3 men remained: the dying father, his trembling son, and the quiet servant tending the fire. Dawson Livingston's breath rattled like torn paper. He had once commanded the land, the men, and the silence around them. But war had stripped everything, leaving only guilt. His son watched in helpless stillness, his jaw locked tight against the growing dread. "You must protect him," Dawson whispered, eyes flicking toward the servant kneeling by the bedside. The man nodded respectfully, but Thomas felt the weight of his father's gaze settle on him instead, a burden no son should inherit. Outside, thunder rolled over Jefferson County like the sound of approaching cavalry. Inside, the candlelight shook against the walls. The 3 men barely spoke, each trapped in the echo of what had already been lost. When Dawson's coughing fit returned, Thomas reached to steady him, but the old man waved him off. "Listen," he croaked. "You must look after him, after all this." The words carried more than command. They carried confession. The servant, Eli, raised his eyes only once, enough for Thomas to see the fear behind them. He had been born into chains, freed by this man's mercy, and bound again by a dying wish that neither could refuse. The fire popped, breaking the silence. Dawson coughed blood into his hand, then spoke again through a rasp. "Promise me, Thomas, you will keep him safe. Whatever comes, he must not be left alone." Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "I swear it," he said. The words burned his throat. In that moment, a promise was made that would bend the shape of every life that followed. Dawson died before dawn. The house fell into stillness that felt colder than winter. Thomas stood beside Eli at the grave, both men silent beneath the wet sky. No priest came. No neighbors dared attend. Afterward, they stood by the open fields, looking toward the north where distant cannon fire echoed faintly. The war had grown near. The land was splitting, and the young master knew soon he would be forced to choose. By the second week, riders came at night, men with covered faces, nailing threats to the fence posts. "Union sympathizers will burn," one read. Eli found it first and said nothing, only folded it into his coat. Thomas began sleeping with his rifle loaded beside the bed. He'd hear hoofbeats at the edge of the property, see lanterns flicker beyond the trees. The silence between the sounds was worse than the sounds themselves. Then one night, the barn went up in flames. They fought the fire until dawn, the smell of burning hay mixing with gunpowder smoke. By morning, only black ash remained, and tracks of horses leading east. Thomas knew it was time to leave. He packed little: his father's watch, a metal box of savings, and 2 rifles. Eli carried the food and blankets. The third man, Samuel, drove the wagon. None looked back. The dirt road wound through empty fields, every mile darker than the last. Town after town turned them away. Taverns shut their doors. Soldiers checked their papers with mocking grins. Every stop carried new insult, new reminder of what they were. When night fell, they camped by rivers. The firelight threw shadows across their faces, 3 men against a country tearing itself apart. Thomas stared into the flames, wondering how far a promise could reach before it broke. They reached a small border town after days of rain. A trader told them of safe passage north, if they could pay. They could not, so they forged papers and prayed their luck would last one more checkpoint. Eli kept his distance in public. Even among soldiers of the Union, glances carried quiet judgment. One officer spat near them and muttered something about traitors and filth. Thomas clenched his fists, but said nothing. When they finally crossed into Pennsylvania, the world didn't change. It only pretended to. The same stares, the same whispers, but colder air. The same promise burning heavier in Thomas's chest. They found work where they could. Thomas lifted iron in a foundry. Samuel hauled coal. Eli stitched torn uniforms for men who would never thank him. Every night they came home covered in the same soot. War paid well only for death. Living came expensive. They shared a single room that smelled of sweat and metal. Yet even there, Thomas made sure Eli had the bed nearest the window, a quiet defiance against the world outside. One evening, returning late, Thomas found the door ajar. Inside, Eli sat in the dark, holding a letter from the South. "Your land's been taken," he said quietly. "Confederates burned it down." Thomas sank into the chair beside him. The news hit harder than expected. That land wasn't just property. It was the last place his father had lived, the last ground where his promise still meant something. Weeks passed. The war thundered on. Men died by the thousands. And yet for Thomas, the fight was smaller, a daily struggle between dignity and survival. He stopped counting the days after the 50th time someone refused to shake his hand. Still, he kept the promise. Eli stayed safe. Through sickness, through hunger, through the slow rot of winter. The bond between them grew, not as equals perhaps, but as men bound by shared ruin. The war finally ended in a burst of celebration Thomas couldn't join. Bells rang in the streets, flags waved from rooftops, but victory felt hollow. He saw only ghosts, his father's, his land's, his own. Then word came, restitution. They could reclaim what was stolen. It would take lawyers, time, and all the money they didn't have, but it was a chance. Thomas decided they would return home. The journey back was longer than the escape. The land had changed, the people hadn't. Burned fences, abandoned barns, silence that felt like warning. When they reached the old property, the air still smelled of smoke. The main house stood crooked and hollow. Windows shattered, graffiti carved into doors. Thomas dismounted slowly, boots sinking into ash. Eli stepped beside him, shoulders tense but proud. They had returned to nothing. That night, Thomas walked through the ruins alone. His father's study stripped bare. The parlor collapsed. The barn gone. Only the foundation stones remained, blackened by the same fire that had started everything. He found his father's old chair, overturned but intact. Sitting there, surrounded by ruin, he whispered the promise again. "I kept him safe." The words echoed back, hollow but true. Outside, the wind carried distant laughter, men drinking somewhere beyond the trees. Thomas listened until it faded, and for the first time since the war began, felt fear not of soldiers, but of silence. Eli joined him on the porch. Neither spoke. The stars above were bright, cruel witnesses to a promise that had survived everything except peace. The land was dead, but the vow was alive, waiting for its next cost. And deep in Thomas's chest, where duty and sorrow met, something began to change shape. slow, dark, inevitable. The kind of change that always comes before tragedy. Snow fell in slow, cruel flakes across the rooftops of Harrisburg. The streets reeked of smoke and desperation, filled with men trying to forget the war and those trying to survive it. Thomas Livingston adjusted his coat against the biting wind, his boots crunching on frozen mud. Behind him walked Eli and Samuel, the only remnants of a world consumed by fire and betrayal. They had come north chasing freedom, but found only another form of cage. Factories replaced plantations, and smoke replaced chains. The same weight, just a different name. Thomas took work at the iron foundry, 12-hour shifts breathing molten dust. The clang of hammers became his heartbeat. He worked like a man who didn't want to think. Eli mended soldiers' uniforms in a backroom shop lit by oil lamps. The overseer never spoke to him except to complain. He took it with quiet endurance that broke Thomas's heart. Samuel hauled coal for the rail lines. Every evening his hands came back black as tar, his eyes red with exhaustion. Yet he smiled. Always the soldier, still pretending to be unbroken. At night, they gathered in the same room, 3 men bound by ash, grief, and stubborn will. The walls sweated cold, the floor creaked, but their silence carried the weight of brotherhood. Thomas would often stare into the single candle flickering on the table. He saw ghosts there, his father's pale hand, his home burning, promises buried in mud. He spoke to none of it aloud. Eli sometimes caught him watching and said quietly, "The past feeds on us if we let it." His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed a man still chained by something deeper than memory. When spring came, the rivers melted and the city stank of rot. Thomas's lungs burned from the forge fumes, but he endured. Work meant noise, and noise meant no thinking. Rumors drifted through taverns, of southern lands returning to their old masters, of violence flaring again where the war had barely ended. Each whisper carried the echo of old ghosts calling them home. One evening, a letter arrived from Baltimore. It bore a lawyer's seal. Thomas opened it by the window, the paper trembling in his hands. "Property restitution possible," it said. His father's land might be reclaimed. The 3 men sat long that night. Samuel wanted to stay. He'd found a kind of peace in labor. Eli said nothing for a while, then whispered, "Some graves don't stay buried forever." Thomas looked between them. "We go back," he said. His voice carried no pride, only inevitability. He couldn't leave the promise unfinished, not when the land still called his name. They sold what little they had and joined a caravan heading south. Wagons creaked through valleys where ghosts of the war still walked. Burned fields, empty towns, silence thicker than fog. Each night, Thomas dreamed of fire. He saw the same house collapsing, the same sky bleeding red. He'd wake sweating, heart pounding, gripping his father's watch like it could rewind time. Crossing into West Virginia, they saw the scars of both war and hate. Charred crosses stood beside roads like warnings. Yet Thomas pressed on, eyes fixed on a horizon he both feared and needed. In a roadside tavern, men whispered as they entered. Old soldiers with missing limbs stared with hostility that hadn't cooled in peace. One muttered, "Yankee filth bringing traitors with him." Thomas ignored it. But Samuel's fists clenched and Eli's jaw tightened. The room's heat rose with every glance. Only when they left did Thomas breathe again, realizing how close the air had come to blood. They camped near the ruins of an old mill. The fire crackled against the black sky. "We survived the war," Samuel said, "but peace, it doesn't want us." His words hung heavy between them. Eli added softly, "Peace is a lie men tell themselves when the noise stops." His gaze stayed on the flames, his face unreadable. Thomas said nothing, only fed another stick to the fire. By dawn, frost coated their blankets. They continued south, passing fields littered with bones half buried in mud, not of soldiers but of horses, oxen, the forgotten casualties of a dying nation. When they finally reached Jefferson County, the hills looked smaller. The trees had thinned, the soil hardened. The Livingston estate rose in the distance like a ghost wearing a broken crown. They approached on foot. Windows gaped like empty eyes. The smell of soot still lingered after years. Thomas stopped at the gate, fingers brushing the rusted iron. "We're home," he murmured, voice flat as stone. Eli walked beside him, scanning the emptiness. "Home," he echoed, though it sounded more like a prayer than truth. The wind moaned through the burned fields like memory refusing to die. That night, they slept in what was left of the stable. The stars burned above, indifferent and cold. Thomas couldn't close his eyes. Every creak of wood sounded like his father's cough. Morning revealed the damage clearer. The main hall gutted, the parlor torn apart. Yet amid the ruins stood his father's chair, untouched, waiting like a relic. He ran a hand over the scorched armrest. In the stillness, Eli spoke. "It remembers him." Thomas nodded. "It remembers everything." The weight of years pressed down until breathing felt like trespass. They worked for weeks repairing walls and roofs, hammering until their hands bled. Passing riders stared, some laughing, some spitting. They were rebuilding defiance, and defiance drew hate like blood draws flies. One night, Thomas heard horses again, distant, circling. He gripped the rifle beside his bed. Through the cracked window, he saw shadows watching, motionless, patient. Then they were gone. Eli entered the room quietly. "It begins again," he said. Thomas looked toward the dark horizon. The promise he'd made now pulsed like a wound that refused to close. Somewhere out there, men still carried the war in their hearts. Somewhere nearby, someone remembered the name Livingston, and the oath of vengeance left unpaid. And under that same roof where his father had died, Thomas realized peace had never truly come north or south. It only waited, sharpening its knife in silence. The sun bled weak light over the broken roof as Thomas stepped outside, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. Around him, the land still carried the smell of smoke and iron. Eli stood near the fence, mending a loose post with steady hands. His silence had become part of the rhythm of the place. Hammer, breath, silence, repeat. Each sound echoed through the empty hills. Samuel hauled firewood from the far shed, stacking it in neat rows by the door. He moved slower now, his limp worsening with the cold, but never once asked for rest. The Livingston property looked half alive, boards nailed over shattered windows, patched walls holding back the wind. 3 men living among ghosts, shaping the bones of something long dead. At night, the house whispered. Thomas would wake to the sound of footsteps, faint, deliberate. He'd rise, rifle in hand, only to find the hall empty and the air colder than before. He began keeping watch from the porch, lantern beside him, eyes trained on the tree line. Some nights, he saw movement, just enough to know they were being watched again. "Maybe they'll come sooner this time," Samuel muttered one evening, sharpening his knife. Eli didn't look up from the fire. "Then let them," he said. "The dead can meet the dead." Thomas said nothing. His promise had turned into something else. Not protection now, but vengeance coiled tight inside him, waiting for the next trespass to justify its release. By spring, their repairs had turned the ruin into shelter again. The roof no longer leaked, the walls no longer rattled. Yet the quiet around them grew heavier, more unnatural with each dawn. Word spread through the county that the Union Fool had returned. Riders passed the gate often now, eyes hidden under hats. No one spoke to them directly, but the silence itself was a threat. Then one morning, Thomas found a sign nailed to the oak near the barn. A black circle burned into the wood. Beneath it, 3 words. "Still watching you." Eli tore it down and threw it into the fire without a word. Samuel spat into the dirt. Thomas just stared, the veins in his neck tight. He knew what it meant. The circle wasn't random. It belonged to the local order that called itself the Wardens of Purity. Men who refused to let the war die, men who fed on fear and tradition. That night, the 3 gathered in the kitchen. Rain lashed the windows, thunder rolling like artillery. "They won't stop," Samuel said. "They never do." Eli nodded. "Then we won't wait." Thomas stood, the lamplight hard on his face. "No more running," he said. "This land is ours, bought in blood. Let them come, and let them learn what their ghosts taught me." For days they prepared. They reinforced the doors, buried blades in the walls, and rigged lantern oil along the porch rail, the same oil once used in foundries, now turned to defense. They watched the road daily. The same group of riders appeared near sundown, staying just long enough to make their presence known. Each evening, they lingered closer. Then, one quiet afternoon, Thomas found footprints near the well, fresh, heavy, leading toward the barn. Inside, the hay was disturbed, and a message scratched into a beam. "Soon," he called the others. No one spoke. The silence of the barn swallowed their anger whole. Finally, Eli said softly, "They already walk where they please. That means it's time." The next night, Thomas stayed awake in the main room, shotgun across his knees. The fire hissed in the hearth. Every sound was a warning. Every heartbeat counted seconds toward violence. At midnight, hooves broke the silence, 4 of them moving fast. Thomas motioned for the lamps to stay low. Eli crouched by the window, Samuel by the back door. The house exhaled tension. The first shot shattered the night. Glass exploded. The bullet buried itself in the wall beside Thomas's head. He ducked low, rolled, fired back. The echoes chased each other through the darkness. Outside, figures dismounted, shouting orders. Thomas recognized one voice instantly. Harsh, guttural, the same that had mocked his father's grave years before. He smiled grimly in the dark. "Welcome home." The fight lasted minutes but felt eternal. Muzzle flashes lit the field. Wood splintered. Samuel roared, firing through the door until the rifle clicked empty. Then, sudden silence. When dawn came, the yard was empty again. Only blood trails and boot prints leading back toward the hills. One hat lay in the mud, stitched with the same black circle. They'd survived, but survival no longer satisfied Thomas. He wanted them erased, not just repelled. Every shot fired had only deepened his hunger to answer violence with something greater. Days turned to weeks, and revenge grew in him like disease. He began gathering information, names, locations, habits. Eli said little, but his eyes told the same truth. There would be no peace now. By midsummer, they knew who led the Wardens. Men once soldiers, now scavengers of fear. Their leader, a man named Redden, owned the general store 2 towns away. Thomas planned to visit. They rode at dawn, the road cloaked in fog. None spoke. Each knew what they were about to do would bind them beyond salvation. Justice had died long ago. This was something older. At the store, Redden greeted them with false warmth. "Didn't expect to see the ghost of Livingston," he sneered. Thomas smiled faintly, stepping closer. "Ghosts don't visit," he said. "They collect." What happened inside was quick and brutal. Wood cracking, fists colliding, breath choking out between curses. When Thomas left, his hands were red, and Redden would never threaten anyone again. They didn't return home immediately. They rode into the hills, burning every symbol of the Wardens they found. Crosses, flags, letters, all turned to ash. The fire painted the night orange. By the time they returned, the house smelled of rain again. For a moment, Thomas thought the land might rest, but vengeance doesn't rest, and it waits, and the hills still whispered names. Samuel began dreaming of battlefields again, waking screaming. Eli walked the property in silence, knife always visible. Thomas spent hours staring at the road, waiting for riders who never came. The violence had stopped, but not the war inside them. The promise Dawson made his son keep had twisted beyond recognition. No longer protection, but punishment masquerading as duty. One night, thunder rolled over the hills again. Thomas stepped outside, rifle in hand, staring into the black horizon. He thought he saw movement by the trees, a shadow watching, silent. He didn't chase it. He just whispered into the wind, "I'm still here." Somewhere out there, another man likely did the same. And between them stretched the endless ghost of the war itself. Dawn came with a pale mist crawling over the hills, the kind that hid tracks and muffled sound. Thomas stood at the fence line, hands on the cold wood, staring toward the distant ridge. Eli joined him silently, the smell of damp soil thick in the air. They had rebuilt what they could, but nothing in that valley felt alive anymore. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. Samuel emerged from the barn, coat draped over his shoulders, rifle slung across his back. His face carried the look of a man who'd stopped waiting for peace a long time ago. The war had ended for everyone else, but not for them. In their small patch of earth, it had only changed shape, from muskets and flags to silence and ghosts. Thomas hadn't spoken much since the night of Redden's death. He worked the fields, mended fences, but his eyes drifted toward the horizon as if he were listening for something the others couldn't hear. When Eli tried to speak of forgiveness, Thomas only said, "Forgiveness feeds the wolves. We starve them by being worse." His words landed like cold stones, final and unmovable. The following weeks brought quiet that was almost unbearable. No riders came, no threats appeared, yet each man felt the waiting, a kind of dread that hummed beneath the stillness. Then, one evening, smoke appeared beyond the western ridge, a column rising against the sky, faint but deliberate. "Signal fire," Samuel muttered. "They're gathering again." Thomas didn't blink. "Good," he said. His voice carried none of the fear that twisted in the others' chests. "Let them come. This time we finish it." They spent the next 3 days preparing the property as a fortress. Oil-soaked trenches along the fence, trip lines at the doors, blades hidden beneath the floorboards, each task done in silence. By the 4th night, the air changed, the wind died, leaving only the sound of crickets and heartbeats. Then came the faint rhythm of hooves, slow, measured, approaching through the fog. Eli watched from the attic window, lantern light flickering across his face. "5 riders," he whispered. "No torches." Samuel tightened his grip on the rifle. "That means they've done this before." Thomas waited by the front door, shotgun resting against his shoulder. "Then they'll do it one last time," he said. The words were a promise, not of defense, but of extermination. The first bullet shattered a window. The second hit the porch rail, splintering wood into his boots. Thomas fired back, the thunder of gunfire echoing through the valley like the memory of old battles. Samuel took the flank, firing from the barn window until smoke filled the air. Eli moved through the shadows like a ghost, blade flashing once, twice, before vanishing again. By midnight, the field was quiet except for groans and the crackle of small fires. 5 men lay scattered in the grass, 4 dead, 1 barely breathing. Thomas approached the wounded one, kneeling beside him. The man's eyes flickered open, glazed with pain and recognition. "You can't kill what's already coming," he rasped. "What's coming?" Thomas asked, voice flat. The man smiled, blood bubbling on his lips. "Everyone else?" Then his breath stopped, carried off by the wind. They buried the bodies at the edge of the field, no markers, no prayers. Thomas said only, "Let the earth decide if they're worth keeping," then turned away, leaving the soil unblessed. Days passed without incident, yet each night new fires burned along the horizon. They were being surrounded, not by men of war, but by vengeance that spread like plague through old loyalties. Samuel wanted to flee. "There's still time," he urged. "We can vanish west, find new land." Eli said nothing. He looked at Thomas, knowing the answer before it came. "I was born here," Thomas said. "My father died here. My enemies burned this ground, and I buried them in it. I'll leave when the dirt spits me out." That night, the wind carried a different sound. The steady march of dozens of boots. Torches moved across the ridge like a river of fire. Eli whispered, "It's the whole county." Thomas nodded once. "Then we end it together." He handed each man a flask, steel cold, filled with whiskey. "For courage," he said. "For the last time we'll need it." When the attack came, it was fury made flesh. Torches arced through the air. Flames devoured fences and climbed walls. Bullets tore through the windows. The night screamed with gunfire and hate. Thomas moved like he'd been born for it. Every shot was precise, every strike deliberate. He fought not for victory, but to carve his name into the violence itself. Eli fought beside him until his rifle jammed. Then he drew his blade and met the fire face first, cutting through the smoke until his arms trembled. Samuel held the line at the back, refusing retreat. By dawn, the house was a skeleton of flames. The attackers scattered, many never rising again. Thomas stumbled into the field, face blackened, coat burning at the edges, but still standing. Eli found him kneeling among the dead. The sunrise painted everything in gold, the grass, the blood, the faces of the fallen. "It's over," Eli said softly. Thomas shook his head. "No," he murmured. "It never ends. It just waits for new men to carry it." His hands trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion of the soul. They buried Samuel that afternoon beneath the tree line. He'd fallen shielding the doorway, his final bullets still chambered. Thomas carved his name into the wood with the same knife that had built the fence. That night, rain fell again, washing soot into the soil. Eli sat on the porch, staring at the hills. "What now?" he asked. Thomas looked toward the horizon, the same direction his father had once prayed toward. "Now," he said, "we make sure they never return, even if it means we vanish too." The next morning, they packed what little remained. Before leaving, Thomas doused the last walls of the manor in oil, struck a match, and tossed it behind him. Flames roared to life, devouring everything that had once been home. The sky turned red, the smoke rising like the final breath of a cursed generation. Neither man looked back. They rode north until the sun began to fade again. The road stretched endless before them, the sound of hooves rhythmic and hollow. Behind them, the valley burned itself clean. By dusk, only ash remained where Livingston Manor once stood. The wind carried nothing but the faint scent of rain and iron, the last memory of men who'd tried to bury their ghosts in fire.